Thank you. So for those of you who are familiar with our work, you'll know that for a very long time, we've been trying to warn about the way that our governments on both left and right, and even green and independents, have been blindly supporting global trade as a way of making the economy grow. Now, this started at the very beginning of the modern economy, because it started with global traders who were spreading across the world and using force, genocide, slavery, and enclosures to drive people away from land-based self-reliance to produce monocultures for export. Now, that could be cotton or tea or mining, or in the beginning, it was very much the primary production. And with this force came later an economic concept known as comparative advantage. And that principle, which is the foundation of the modern economy, maintains that it's in every region's interest to specialize for export and then import their needs. It makes sense on the surface, but actually we really now need to step back to understand that this formula has taken us down a road that has led to every government continuing to support, subsidize, and deregulate global banks and corporations, while imposing heavy bureaucracy, regulation on every national, local, regional business. Even national industries have been under the surveillance of governments, and they have been taxed and regulated, while the global players, the global traders, the TNCs, the global financial institutions have had no such regulation. And through trade treaties, they have been pressuring governments to sign in black and white that they will not do anything that will reduce their profits. No protection of jobs, no protection of the poor, no protection of the environment. We are convinced that if the majority of people really, truly looked at this global system and what it's doing to every region, every country, they would not go along with it. Whether they were right-wing or left-wing, whether they were green or not green, they could not go along with it, because it means that we have a de facto government of giant corporations imposing their need to make profit, and that profit über alles is the most important thing. Now, I think it's really important to realize that this is happening because no one has been charged with the task of stepping back to look at the global impact of the global economy on national, regional, local economies. In that sense, I feel a little bit hopeful, because I know from talking to grassroots activists, from talking to government people, from talking to people in global corporations and banks, that they are not looking at this global picture. They are using the language of biodiversity, climate, jobs, growth, to keep going in the same direction. And in fact, when you try to get people to look at what's happening, they look at you as though you're crazy, because they have not heard it. because people aren't saying it. People aren't talking about the global economy. Instead, they're mired in a national discussion about such and such a prime minister, such and such a party. And as we know, the left generally has been more concerned with poverty, more concerned with trying to distribute resources in a more equitable way. And we talk about neoliberal, conservative economics and economists as the problem, that we're not looking at the global picture. And so for me, in this discussion about UBI, I want to urge you all to frame it within that bigger picture, to frame your argument for building a movement for economic change, to frame it in the light of the fact that the current policies that go beyond left and right are actually impoverishing the majority. The middle classes are getting poorer and poorer. In Sweden, in America, I'm sure, in your country too, they are getting poorer and poorer. And you have to look at the reality of poverty as defined by how many hours you have to work to pay for a roof over your head, to pay for food, to pay for your basic needs. You cannot look anymore at the quantities of money to understand the truth of what's going on. The impoverishment of the majority, running faster and faster, working harder and harder, includes our governments. Our governments are actually getting poorer and poorer vis-a-vis this global de facto empire of interlinked corporations and banks. And today, the most dangerous aspect of this is that there's been a type of marriage between AI, high tech, and the global technological systems, and the military, and the speculative casino, in which young men, often very nice men, sit in front of a computer and speculate on the value of our jobs, of our food, of our democracy. And this casino is allowed to run without regulation, without oversight. It's a horrific system. It's very destructive. But the good news is that it's only there because we are blind to it. And I honestly, I see that we are allowing those tech billionaires who are now earning billions in a year, we are allowing them to think of themselves as socially active, generous individuals, because they are not being forced to look at the big picture either. So UBI is coming out of the best intentions, the clarity that people who are working harder and harder, how are they going to have the time to concern themselves with the climate issue? How are they going to be able to help us create a healthier, happier, truly more sustainable society? Because that poverty, of course, is the poverty is trickling downwards, but as I say, it's also trickling upwards. I want to make the point also that even as a CEO of Mobil, the CEO was running very, very fast in fear of a merger in which he might lose his job. So when Exxon and Mobil merged, I don't know who won, but 2 jobs were turned into 1. And this fear and this need to stay on top and to stay running is part of the systemic drivers of this system and what leaves people more and more blind. So to try to provide a safety net a universal basic income that would remove this pressure would be a truly wonderful thing. But I really urge you not to frame that without including this broader economic framing. Because if we don't, the worry is that UBI in some countries will mean that governments will dole out a bit of money, some crumbs, but while they continue to support the tech giants, and with it actually the military establishment, where the high-tech search is for minerals on Mars with the help of the war machine, where with the help of the war machine also searching the deepest seabed for more minerals, because this high-tech path with AI, including the cryptocurrencies, including the solutions that the internet and AI offer, all require huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of minerals that are chewing away the earth and destroying the lives of billions of people. And the path that the whole system is geared towards, the globalizing path, is one that will continue to remove us from the land, which is how it started, into cities to become completely dependent on a global corporate system. And in those cities, we are now being promised that we will have a local future, a walking distance future, that we will have AI to do the farming on the land, and we'll even have AI high-rise agriculture in the city, indoor agriculture, hydroponic agriculture, and this system will provide for our needs. That system cannot provide for the deep needs that we all have, for connection to each other, meaningful connection, meaningful interdependence, the need we all have for meaningful work, to feel that we are contributing to society. It cannot provide for the needs of nature, the fundamental need of diversity. This system is imposing monoculture. It's a worldwide monoculture. We can see what these corporations are doing in agriculture, pharmaceuticals, engineering, all standard products that are meant to be distributed globally and meant to be applied globally in a sustainable way. They cannot. So from our point of view, the localization movement is an unstoppable force because it's a movement that helps people to connect to each other, that helps people to build structures that are more visible, more accountable, more human scale, where people can see the impact of what they do, the impact on nature, the impact on others, where they can actually start to become truly more responsible and also more proud and more aware of their meaningful impact on life around them, on their community, on the living world. So we see it as inevitable that we will be moving towards more localized futures. But where we are today, where can we intervene to help to shift this giant system? UBI could be a very important part of that, but it needs to be framed within the context of halting the juggernaut continuation of globalizing trade-based development. It needs to be within the context of seeing that your government is not going to be continuing to hand over power and punish local and national players while handing out a little bit of money to the bottom just so that they can keep going and keep consuming. No, we need meaningful, transformative change. So the package that we need to demand is that what is taxed, what is regulated, and what is subsidized. We need to be looking at those mechanisms to really expose what our governments are doing to genuinely support true democratic, equitable, and ecological development. We need to look at the fact that we need a growth. We need a growth in the number of jobs. We need a growth in the number of businesses. We should be clearly spelling out the way that the current trajectory destroys millions of smaller businesses and farmers while continuing to make fewer and fewer, bigger and bigger, richer and richer. We need to be looking at how the taxes and regulations are all the time favoring business to use more technology, more energy, more minerals, more natural resources, while destroying jobs. Right now, everything we do to hand over jobs to AI is a step in the wrong direction. Yes, AI might be useful, and is of course already being used, to monitor climate, to avert catastrophe, to be used in times of catastrophe, to be used in times of the need for very rapid communication, to protect people and the environment. But we should be understanding and looking clearly at the use of that to replace people in meaningful and far more gratifying jobs. We don't want robots to look after us when we're ill. We don't want robots teaching our children in school. We don't need robots to build our houses. We don't need robots as companions, which is beginning to happen in Japan. If we actually support a path that allows us to rebuild the community fabric. So as we look at UBI, and as we look at this beautiful intention of trying to help people who are struggling to have a sense of security, which is foundational for people. It's something that is a human right to feel secure in our society. It should be a human right in our societies, all of them, that we ensure that everyone is provided for and that there is that security. Because as the insecurity grows, we can see the competition, we can see the fear, we can see a swing to the right. So this movement for UBI is a beautiful example of the fact that more and more people all around the world don't support this path. They're not behind this path that keeps destroying jobs, that keeps everyone running faster and faster just to survive, and that then in turn leads to a swing to the right, that leads to more friction, to more prejudice, to more fear of the immigrants, to more fear of the other. All of this comes out of this fear and insecurity created by the economic system. But as I said before, in order to really move in the direction of deep security, of reconnection, rebuilding the human webs of interdependence that we evolved with, that we need, this need to feel connected and to feel the right to a secure livelihood, a meaningful livelihood, that need is universal. I believe that if you link your request for UBI and the building up of that movement very clearly to the message that the dominant path is what's creating poverty and the impoverishing, as I said, the middle classes, even our governments. If you keep that as a central motif and then make it clear to people that the same path that's making us poorer, that's making us run faster and faster just to pay for the roof over our head, to just pay for food, the same economic policies that do that to us are the same policies that are responsible for climate chaos, extinction of species, and, as it happens, are making a joke of democracy, a complete joke of democracy. The same policies, let's not forget, in this corporate handover of power, subsidizing giant monopolies, is the path that has created a media, a global media of corporate entities interlinked, preventing a genuine discussion of what's going on. So we need to recognize that this same economic path that destroys jobs, destroys the environment, destroys democracy to a great extent by controlling the media. Even worse and more insidious is that money has also colonized science. In my work and as a founder of the International Forum on Globalization, we worked with scientists around the world who could see that these trade treaties that handed over power to global corporations were linked to the way that universities were now more and more funded and run by global corporations. We could see that genetic engineering didn't come from individual human scale institutions, didn't emanate from government interest or from environmental interest. It emanated from global corporate interest in profit. So genetic engineering was brought in as a way for Monsanto and Unilever and other giant businesses to be able to profit more, both in agriculture and medicine. It's really important that we understand that this is not really an issue about ethics. It's not an issue to do with good guys and bad guys, because the insidious growth has been happening blindly. So there are many well-intentioned scientists who were completely behind genetic engineering because they were told, we must have genetic engineering to feed the world. There are so many people, how are we going to manage? Now, once we step back and look at the bigger picture, the good thing is that it's not useful to be blaming individual corporations or individual politicians, or it's really not about blame, because all of us in one way or another have blindly contributed to this system, even if only by being ignorant of certain aspects of it. So now, as we try to look at the big picture, and as we try to build a different economic direction, let's keep UBI within the framing of this shift away from a competitive global path of more and more specialization, more and more control by big business, in science, in the media, in every avenue of knowledge. Let's try to look at the truth that at the grassroots, small farms, local initiatives, local business alliances are demonstrating that people long for a more healthy, a more meaningful, a more connected way of living. We are seeing the most amazing benefits of even prisoners, juvenile delinquents, deeply depressed, traumatized people, particularly as they connect with each other and over land, as they connect to people and to nature. We are seeing examples worldwide of a very rapid healing of people and ecosystems. The path forward that builds community, that genuinely rebuilds biodiversity instead of talking about it, that actually supports diversified production for local needs, that path of smaller scale, many farms, many businesses, many jobs, is demonstrating a fundamental healing. And it's demonstrating that even addicted youth, who are addicted, by the way, to computers and computer games, have been helped, because the deep, deep truth is that we evolved in intergenerational communities, interdependent with each other, interdependent with the plants, with the animals, with the water, with life. That's in our DNA, that's in our evolution. And that truth is being demonstrated again and again as victims of a competitive, meaningless, anti-ecological, anti-feminine system, lead to increases in depression, trauma, mental disorders. Once you start looking at the statistics and you look at it framed by the global competitive path versus the localizing path, the evidence is there. Problem is that we need more voices, we need more funding also to do the research, to make the films, to provide this evidence from around the world. And I hope that most of you who are listening will look at our World Localization Day program, where we're working with people on every continent in about 30 countries, where at the local level, and even at the government level, at the local government level, we're beginning to see the realities of the land and the realities of society pressuring towards policy change in that direction, towards a really genuine healing of nature and people. So we have quite a lot of evidence, but gathering it from all around the world and presenting it in a world where the media closes it out, where even the internet media has ways of shutting it out. That's a big task. And that's why we need all of us to be talking to each other, to finding ways of having newsletters, local radio, local newspapers, face-to-face conferences, just doing everything we can to build up the communication, the big picture, so that we can bring together this artificial divide between what the environment needs and what we need, the artificial divide between different countries, between the peoples of this world, these divides that are now being created with the help of AI-run social media, dividing us around gender, around race. These are artificial divisions that are constructed and that are encouraged in a world where people live through the intellect, through concepts about the world. In the real world of face-to-face interdependence. And I also just want to add before I stop that one of the beautiful bits of evidence we have is that in crises, and there are lots of them these days, whether the pandemic or climate shocks, we see evidence around the world, not always, not everywhere, but enough evidence to be so heartened by the benefits that come when people are out helping each other face to face. So we are seeing people who suffer from depression being enlivened by the fact that just here in the area where I live in Australia, we had terrible floods recently. And there were people out helping day after day. And they were so enlivened and inspired by the experience of being able to do something meaningful, to do something where they could see that they were actually helping people whom they could interact with, that even depression was eased by that work of supporting each other in these face-to-face, community-based, localized way. So I'm so hoping that we can have more of a discussion now. I think this is, are we in agreement now that we should go on to questions? Does that sound right?
Yes, it sounds right.
Okay.
Okay, let's go for the questions now.
Thank you. Thank you.
So as you can hear, your words were warmly accepted. And I'm very grateful for that, because to be honest, you're really speaking from my heart. Since my early childhood, I felt the deep connection, the deep desire to connect with all the people around. And as I was growing, my desire was growing. And like inviting you to speak here today, it's also like kind of my way to try to reconnect in this disconnected world where everyone is considered an individual. So once again, thanks a lot. And I'm also curious about like what the questions are going to be right now. And thank you, Karl. Before that, I would maybe try to encourage the women in the room to say the first question or comment. Please. Okay, so maybe we will hold them by the way that Karl starts.
Hi, I appreciated your talk a lot. It seemed to me when you were pointing out the connection between, I think this connection is hugely important, that through the enclosure movement, the colonial movement, people have been thrown off the land, and that makes us all dependent wage laborers, way up into the middle class. We're dependent wage laborers around the world on this global system that is so hungry for resources. But there was, and you talked about looking at both ends of this, but there seems to me that there's one obvious way to connect these that you didn't mention. So I thought I would bring it up and see what you think about it, which is you tax resources. You tax the people who own, hoard, use, or use up resources, or pollute resources that they don't even own, with pollution taxes, carbon taxes, land taxes, resource extraction taxes, and those kinds of things. And you take that revenue and you redistribute it as a basic income, linking the two. And then also that has the advantage not only of doing both of the things we want, freeing the people and discouraging this wasteful resource use, but also it gives an obvious moral justification why you're doing both things. If you are paying more than you receive, it is because you are above average depleter of our precious resources. If you're receiving more than you pay, then you're being rewarded for being a below average polluter. That just seems like there's just, although I've heard this many times before in other sources, but it just screamed to me that this was so linked to the kind of things you were saying. I thought I'd ask you what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely linked, and it's definitely the kind of thing we need to do. But the big problem is that if we do not clearly look at what our governments are doing at the global level, if we don't look at how governments are giving freedom to global banks and corporations, then all of these measures to tax and to try to institute some kind of just system, whether in the form of UBI or in the form of, both environmental protection, become a bit of a joke. Because if our governments on the one hand are saying to Unilever and don't forget also to the global media that you can come in and dominate the discourse in our country completely freely, where again, there's no hope really of genuine democracy when that's going on. So it can sound almost impossible to do something about, but the only reason it is because nobody's talking about it. So within the current situation, it's actually quite dangerous to bring in these tax measures because they punish even further local businesses. Even small local farmers are now being destroyed by a lot of the carbon jargon that's actually been brought in by big business. And the carbon argument is actually being used to insist that small farmers should be buying and be linked to drones, linked to robots, linked to satellites to measure carbon. We're in a very difficult situation because big business are also coming out with narratives where they completely agree with us that industrial agriculture has been terrible. There was a big BBC coverage a few months ago about how our food doesn't have any nutrition anymore. And they were arguing that all the arguments we would make about fossil fuel-based agriculture, how destructive it's been of the soil, and how food now doesn't have the nutritional value that it did 30, 40 years ago. And the solution? To monitor the nutritional content of food. And what that meant was we're going to need AI technology, very expensive, very lucrative for a few big corporations, and help to destroy small farmers. So actually, people who are working on the ground, who are working with genuinely healthy ways of restoring the soil, of rebuilding healthy soils, it's not just about carbon. Carbon is this simplistic corporate way that's being imposed on us. And so in the same way, thinking that at the local or national level, we're going to be taxing while we have the door open to Unilever or Cargill or any of these giant businesses and the supermarket chains to come in with artificially cheap food that's been transported around the world, often several times, destroying the market for the local farmers. So all the values, I know that it can sound overwhelming when I explain what the costs are of this global system, but remember, the only reason it's there is because nobody's talking about it. And when I say nobody, I mean that if you look in academia, you will find people who have critiqued globalization. But when you look at what they're saying, they're keeping the discussion very narrow and they're blaming governments. They're not talking about the role of giant global banks and corporations. They're not talking about the craziness of allowing global banks and financial institutions that were gambling with the value of our mortgages. That was one thing that emerged in 2008, when there was a big crash, global economic crash. The whole world knew then that it was crazy to allow speculators to be trading on the value of our mortgages without any idea who the people were, where they were, what their names were. Everyone knew we need to regulate this global financial casino. But no, we were told by Obama and others, no, they're too big to fail. The thinking was that those giants are actually keeping our economy growing and going. And that is also not true when you contrast it with the realities of strengthening local economies that could actually keep our economies going. But I just want to say one more thing. Really, any environmentalist who starts looking at the economy and who really understands just about GDP, that GDP is a measurement our governments are using of progress. Any environmentalist who starts looking at this should be joining a movement for economic change. Once you understand that GDP goes up with breakdown, with pollution, with ill health, it literally increases. So in a country, if the water is so polluted that it has to be sold in bottles, it's good for GDP. If all of you get cancer and need to have constant chemotherapy, it's good for GDP. Whereas if you were to go home and decide, I'm going to stay healthy and I'm going to grow a garden so I can have healthy, fresh food as the best medicine, that would be unpatriotic. GDP would go down. Theft, crime. If you go home tonight and your television has been stolen, all of you, good for GDP that you go out and buy another television. It's a horrific truth that the ignorance about the economy is the main reason why we're in these crises. No one should be ignoring the need for change to the economy. And it needs to be, you know, understanding GDP. It means to also to take into account what's happening now with these global trade treaties. And then there are all kinds of measures that we can take to do with shifting taxes, to do with genuinely supporting livelihoods, to do with genuine, real UBI. There is huge potential to actually, in a much shorter period than people think, to both restore ecosystems and healthy societies. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. So Jitka, maybe take this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the deep answer. Of course, we are all like looped in the same loop, being hostile, keeping hostile, like all together with our governments and like all the people that would love to live the local life. That also that the narrative of ours is not heard, even when we try to voice it up. And of course, like the big money are in favor of the bigger narrative, louder narrative about like how we actually deserve being poor when we don't try enough and so on. And I believe that also during the crisis, when we see that like the biggest companies are actually using our weakness, being, you know, targeted with the disease, and they are actually making money even on that. And that more and more people maybe understand, but still this is actually like calling for the solution, like how we break the loop. Yeah, more and more voices rising from bottom is one way, but then maybe a few of us are actually trying to sneak the UBI policy into the big thinking about like connected with the climate crisis, and maybe trying to make the governments or even bigger policymakers to see that maybe UBI could, you know, help at least something. And we all believe that once they listen about UBI and they try to experiment more with this concept and policy, that maybe once we happen to have UBI like put into the discourse and in the action, that maybe it could actually start to dismantle this loop and this like keeping hostages thing, that it may be break the loop. So this is actually like how we believe that even with the like not heard discourse, even not like being the big picture you speak about, like you know, heard enough, that it can even be like maybe other reasons leading to imply UBI policy, that the very fact and UBI is like treated well, like fulfilled, like with the right understanding how to put it to the action, then maybe it could help us even without being understood first. Okay, anyone would like to contribute to before we move elsewhere, like to this discussion?
We also have an online question.
Okay, so maybe one more from here and then the online question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to transform what Jitka just commented into a question to Helena. If you could please maybe work a bit more or develop a bit more on how do you think the framing of bigger picture or UBI as a actor of the bigger picture of the economic transformation will help if it's open fight with those who benefit from the current. So once they heard openly about how we are going to change the world and economic system with the help of the UBI, it will be suddenly a target of much bigger force, which will try not to happen. So isn't it better to actually advocate for UBI as it is and just to have it implemented, because the impact of the UBI will be transformative? So that's the question I think that Jitka was actually pointing out.
Yeah, well, I think it is possible that it could be a Trojan horse that could have a transformative effect. But I guess I worry from what I've seen, you know, like even after, I think it was after September 11th, you know, Bush basically said, let's have some money dropped from airplanes, you know, to get people to go out and shop again. And also in other situations, we're seeing here in Australia, we saw in COVID a bit of, you know, handout to just keep things going, essentially. And so I'm worried that it won't be that Trojan horse. And I guess I'm definitely in favor of a campaign that focuses on people's economic hardship and something like UBI rather than a focus, say, just on climate. Generally speaking, the truth is that we need to understand that the social damage that's going on and the environmental damage are linked to the same policies. And we need to try to unite people across this divide of having been led to believe that dealing with climate change means that I have to sacrifice. It's going to cost me. And people are pushed. They're working harder and harder, as I say. And by the way, even that truth that the middle classes throughout the world, even now in China and India, are having to work harder and harder just to stay in place. In other words, they're getting poorer. That truth we're not allowed to articulate. The myth is still going on that we're all doing better, but we're too selfish. We don't want to do anything about climate because we're too greedy and we want our consumer good. This is rubbish. What's going on is that meaningful action on climate change, meaningful action would threaten the corporate trajectory. And so, yeah, so, but to try to answer the question again, I'm just worried about us losing time, because the truth is, as I say, that this dominant path is so destructive to virtually any and everyone who would just stop to think. Like I said, even as a CEO, because they're supporting this path of mergers, because the entire path is you have to get bigger and bigger and merge, whether it's a small farmer, a small business, a small town, a small hospital, a small post office. The path that's being pushed on us is to merge and become bigger to survive. This is destructive to all of us and to the natural world. And so I just feel pretty convinced that if we could focus on the bigger picture, we're going to be able to build more coalitions and get more people on side. And that UBI as part of also big picture building inside the movements, maybe there is a way of keeping one conversation inside the movements to build up the numbers and another public conversation. And so that UBI could perhaps be framed in a way that wouldn't be seen as so threatening. But remember, the real threat is to a distant banking and corporate system beyond your country. That's the real threat. The real, the winners are actually your own government, your own businesses. It's all, I believe it's when you see that bigger picture that the necessity of a very different discussion of what I call eco-literacy, which means both economic literacy linked to ecological literacy, but actually cultural literacy. In other words, the literacy about what human beings need, the literacy about why we have epidemics of depression, increases in suicide, eating disorders, crime and divisiveness, this cost to human beings and human life. We're not even allowed to talk about that. We're not seeing the honest statistics. In England, in the last 5 years, eating disorders among young people have gone up by 85% in the last 5 years. In the last year, it was 35% out of that. Why? We're not talking about that. It's the same corporate economic system that's responsible. So almost any issue that anybody cares about, if they have the big picture, they'll see, oh, I, as someone with a child who has an eating disorder, I, as someone with, a husband who's about to commit suicide because his small business or his farm is being destroyed, there's this huge potential for linking together for the same directional change. So the eco-literacy, economic literacy linked to ecological and social literacy, or another way to put it, big picture activism. I guess I'm still voting for that as essential, but I also would be very happily surprised if you could, in your country, just focus on UBI and find that you really make headway in a meaningful direction. I think it is possible. I think it's possible. But I would still urge you all to try to build up the bigger picture literacy from the bottom up.
Okay, I believe we share both the necessity, feel for the necessity to see the bigger picture, and we're trying to connect all over the active society in Czech Republic to understand that UBI should be the united policy, and also we share the fear that the time is shortening. Now, what would
there was someone over there I saw someone on the right there holding up their hand.
Yeah, that's very true. But we promised one question from the online public, because we also have them here connected. So please. Okay, now you can speak. Hello.
Hello.
There is a lady who has her hand up from the online public. Can you speak, please? Do you hear us?
My name is Louise. I did put the hand up. I'm not sure if
yes, I think it's you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Helena. I share Sabine's message, and it's very inspiring conversation and clarity on the interrelationship between the issues, and also for your lifetime work in the importance of local democracies, local economies, and this stability between the human and its habitat. I'm a pharmaceutical scientist, but I specialize in health economics. And I wonder if, just from the sake of getting the majority that is moderate, it is in the middle, politically speaking, couldn't we anchor the argument for basic income on a health status, because the evidence is overwhelming. Relative poverty claims 2 life years of people. It's the biggest killer after current smoking. Current smoking is still bigger, but it's worse than alcohol. Okay, alcohol claims 0.7 years. So it's a very strong argument, and I don't think this will even resonate with Christian Democrats who follow the social doctrine of church. So we can build more alliances from this human, superhuman anchor point of view, which is also the philosophical basis of basic income. It's like renewing this humanism from the health perspective. I wonder what you think about that as a more communication framework for basic income. Thank you.
Well, I think it is, it's definitely an argument that could have the potential to reach a more mainstream audience. And I really, I'm, from what I've seen in my native country of Sweden, where I grew up, and seeing the changes, and lived in America and now in Australia, and seeing what's happening in China and India and so on. I guess I would love it if it were possible for you to make quick progress in this arena. But what I worry about is many years of attempts for a type of change that would still remain very shallow. It would remain within the confines, first of all, of even the statistics around health and what constitutes health, what constitutes healthcare. Many of the sort of statistics that we're wanting to see people look at, like I say, about particularly mental health and well-being, and the statistics now about serious problems with autism and in the youth, what's happening. Again, what you're talking about now in terms of the health perspective and within the mainstream political discourse in an industrialized country, if it were really the case that you feel that there's a really good chance to make headway, that would of course be beneficial. It would of course be a step in the right direction, but whether the realities of the terrible hardship that's coming because of the way that our governments are strangling local and national economies, and because of the way that governments are impoverishing themselves, so that they keep telling us they're too poor to look after our health or to look after the environment. And so the other part of this economic literacy, which I know it's a little bit complex, but we need to understand what's happened to the actual creation of money. It's not as complicated as I'm probably making it sound now. Once you step back and you realize that it's all connected to allowing global banks and corporations to have the freedom to do as they like, and that means in banking that the money that's being created has absolutely no anchors in any real wealth anymore. And so to have our governments say to these global institutions, you have the freedom to create masses of money, which when you study it, that money is blindly using algorithms, supporting the Walmarts and the Cargills and the giants. It's supporting that spread of a global monoculture in agriculture, in health, in architecture, in engineering, and now particularly because of the AI dependence. And as I said, so when, I don't want to disempower you. I just want to say that please, I hope some of you will go away and want to look at that a bit more. And I can tell you that where we're sitting, we see not only around the world that the small and the local which is often invisible. Even in your country, there'll be examples of what I'm talking about. But it's invisible. It's not covered in the media. It's not covered in academia. Those small examples are so inspiring, and they are spreading, even though they don't have the support of government or the media. And to me, it testifies to this deeper human need that it's a much more radical departure from what you're talking about. At the same time, I feel very heartened by the fact that the new economy movement, in the sense of more academics, more people around the world saying, wait a minute, we've got to rethink the economy. Many of them are not yet, from my point of view, registering the deep truth that the real wealth is the earth, is the soil, is the seeds, the water. The real wealth, the real economy is the living earth. They're not yet looking at that in a serious way and contrasting it with the creation of artificial, it's not even money anymore, it's electronic signals, allowing BlackRock and these giants to put more zeros behind their names only because they have power over our government, only because no one is looking at how this wealth has been created. So again, another thought in all this is we need people to be asking, how can it be that Elon Musk and Facebook, that we're allowing two young men to determine what our media is going to be, and to how on earth have we created a situation where these young men are earning the amounts of money that they are? You know, now CEOs in America, $250 million a year they're earning, $250 million a year. And this gap between what the CEO earns and what the worker earns, we have to be asking why. When are we going to wake up to saying, how far is this going to go? Are we going to have 5 men controlling more wealth than the entire global population? And we're just going to stand by and let that happen? And without asking why it's happening, how it's happening, what are the structures? How do we end up in this situation? That's what we're talking about, that we need to look at. And then I think, you know, at the same time, what you're saying, which is in many ways, I know it sounds more pragmatic, it sounds more realistic, but just remember, you're operating within a system that is so unrealistic, that is so insane, is so crazy, but we're just not being trained to look at it. And I just want to say one more thing about it. Part of it is that looking at it in the way I'm saying now can feel very overwhelming. And that's why a lot of people think, no, it's too hard, it's too big, there's no point. Actually, what we're saying is that when we do, and we realize that the winners are a smaller and smaller number of people, the winners are day by day fewer and fewer people, and the losers are the global population. Then you start saying, yeah, you know, I want to be part of a movement that says we're just crazy if we let this keep going. I mean, you've seen the statistics already about how many men control more wealth than half the global population. This is a crime against humanity. It's an insanity. And, you know, just going on and on about that, I can understand would be very difficult if you weren't also able to support very real, very specific, smaller local initiatives that are starting to point the way. And that's where the real wealth, the soil, the water, food production as central to the rethinking and to the redoing, rebuilding is very important. That's already helping. But when you add to that, as I say, the new economy movement, the articulate, intelligent academics, journalists, writers, voices from around the world, you start getting a sense that, yeah, there, you know, inevitably there will be this more fundamental change. But I hope I'm not putting you off from your thinking. It's difficult.
Yes, I understand. definitely not. I can assure you also that there's plenty of us who are actually trying to live within the regenerative principles, and that we are actually joining powers and trying to nurture our relations. And there's people in favor of eco-villages and communities, and we are part of those. So yeah, I guess like this is the people we are seeking for, like to promote UBI also, like by our hearts, not only the intellect.
Good. I see also the thing is the small, like the eco-villages, the small farms, once we help to get a bigger picture out, so many of these small initiatives can be linked, not by becoming bigger, not by creating some super interlinked movement, but having a language and a shared demand for change, so that there's a way that many small is so much more powerful than one big.
There is one question going to be asked by Klaus, and he's very eager to ask. Okay, let's wait for the mic. Okay.
Thank you very much for your speech, and I agree in many things which you have said. And I want to say the ecological, social transformation of our society, I think is very important, that the social part, UBI, can be one of the elements which are helpful. And now I come with a question. What I am not understand, and I have not heard it at the moment in your speech, I don't agree for the military money which is given, because we can use this money much more for ecological and social aspects. What you are thinking about that, to really be against war?
Absolutely. I mean, and also, I guess, I think I mentioned earlier, but the frightening thing that you do see when you look at the global system is the link between the military, and particularly in America, the Pentagon, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. And there are people who have looked at that without some primitive conspiracy theory, but just to say that after the September 11th, suddenly they saw money being allocated to go into Iraq, when Iraq clearly had nothing to do with September 11th. So there were some voices from the State Department in America interviewed on now what's become alternative television. Someone named Bill Moyers, who used to have a television program, but you know, very credible, authoritative people. In this particular case, someone who had worked in the State Department and started questioning this, and started then understanding that this huge amount of money, again, created out of sight through global speculation, that was overwhelming the government. And in the meanwhile, the government said, oh, no, we can't afford to look after you. We can't afford to look after the poor or health or the environment. But then when you look at the amount of money that's going into the war machine, again, I believe that the majority of people, when asked if there were a real democratic discussion about economic priorities, would not go along with this. And I'm absolutely convinced that the majority of people are against war. So from our point of view, the tragedy is the blindness is allowing giant corporations that have become like machines, and who are now so closely interlinked with AI, that they are like a machine-like growth. This machine-like growth is completely linked to the war machine, and of course, completely linked to an unending appetite for resources and for continuing the fear-mongering between countries and people. So it's a very evil system, because it's built on fear, it's built on this blind greed, that when you look at where is the human being that's driving this, there isn't some evil mastermind sitting above it. And a lot of people now think that WEF, the World Economic Forum, is like the center of all of this. From my point of view, it's not quite like that. It's a much more broad support. Really, the key thing we should be looking at is how governments have believed that growth is created by supporting global trade. If we start looking at that and understanding how they're keeping that going, we'll make much more headway than just focusing on, for instance, the World Economic Forum. I don't know if that's helpful, but I totally agree. I'm a pacifist, and I see these wars as a complete outcome of this crazy economic system.
Okay, any more questions from public presented here? I would like maybe, pardon?
There is one more question that came through the stream. Should I read out?
Yes, please. Perfect.
Seems to be a little bit more general question. Jerzy Prokorny asks, what is your position on the concept of neocolonialism and world systems theory? How do you work with them? What is your theoretical frame?
I worry that the neocolonialism as it's being framed again is a bit too narrow, and that it is encouraging framing that looks at the white male in the world as being the enemy, and that assumes that now indigenous leaders are going to be the leaders. To me, that's too narrow a framing, and I think that the potential for the big picture that I'm trying to share is already in practice leading to situations where in local communities, white men and indigenous people and handicapped people and gay people and what are some of the other vegans as well as meat eaters are coming together for practical, meaningful change that benefits the environment, that benefits the local economy. So we have to be quite careful of residing too much in a world of concepts. And often within the current system, these concepts are now the drivers of division. So yes, neocolonialism is how many people will describe, for instance, globalization as a new form. Fine. But as I say, I'm seeing it also interpreted in a more narrow way. And in terms of world systems, again, I feel that once you step back and look at the bigger picture, then you would be more looking at the one world system, which emanated, as I said earlier, from colonialism, slavery, genocide, and enclosures, very importantly in Europe. People driven off the land to produce for trade, for global traders. And again, as I said, that formula being imposed till today and in an ever more draconian and forceful way by big business, pushing that agenda, I see as a way of understanding the world system that is imposing monoculture worldwide, biological monoculture and human monoculture. So I think I think that understanding it in that more holistic way is what can create the framework where peoples across the world can sing from the same hymn sheet or from the same framework that will bring us together, and that will, I believe, in a very effective and pragmatic way, also support the localization initiatives that are growing from the bottom up and that are also beginning to transform, in some cases, local government policy.
Okay, but there was there was something more to the question, if I remember. Not the other part, about like the concept of the world governance, or?
I think it was answered.
Okay, then hopefully. More questions from the public here?
May I add? Yes, may I add, if you withhold your question because of linguistic problems, feel free also to ask in Hungarian, Czech, German. I think we can translate.
Yes, definitely, please. So, Rodrigo, I believe you were trying to ask. Thank you.
Hello. It's a great pleasure. Okay. It's a great pleasure to meeting you. Okay, I'm supposed to rap, okay? It's a great pleasure meeting you. This is actually my initial exposure to the concept of UBI. I mean, as I have been speaking with other people, I now realize that I have been practicing my own sort of UBI approach. My question was going to be, if you know of a model worldwide that is actually working, incorporating UBI in whichever way is possible. And I think you already answered the question when you referred to small initiatives better than big initiatives. I think that's about the only way we can really approach and resolve this issue. And the arguments that you have been presenting, it reminds me a lot about back in the 1980s when the concept of globalization came up, and I joined a group of people who we were anti-globalization because we were so convinced that the so-called issue of helping economies, and at that time it was already the view that India, Brazil, and China were going to become more healthier in terms of economic and health, etc., which was a total bunch of BS, of course.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was very interesting. I was your neighbor at that time. I mean, I was in Hawaii. And at the University of Hawaii, we had a department in conflict resolution, which involved different disciplines. And we joined the actual discipline that became a theory later on. I mean, it was in Europe, it was taken very seriously. It was the theory called de-development. I don't know if you remember that. But
I do.
Yeah, the theory of de-development is referring exactly to the same topics that you are bringing up and the possible solutions, you know. And it was interesting how at that time such concept was bombarded by the big corporations. What it was not the big global media at the time, but we were actually they tried to shut us down, you know. So it's just observations rather than questions, but I love your points of view because it resonates so much with what we actually went through before with the issue of anti-globalization and de-development theory, which was so wonderful. I still have some interesting articles about how the theory of de-development would have worked wonderfully, but for the same reason that now we're having problems, is not quite so successful. Thank you so much.
Are you thinking of Wolfgang Sachs, or are you thinking also of the degrowth movement?
Yeah.
And Serge Latouche?
Exactly. Degrowth movement, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the degrowth movement is still around and it's actually stronger now, but you see, it's not visible. But it's stronger now than it was then.
Oh, glad to know
so
that.
There are many more people involved now. and yet it's hidden from the mainstream media. And so I do think that once you become aware of the extent to which in media and academia, we're being kept away from meaningful critiques and movement building. There is so much more going on than we realize. And then when you add, so there's the two things. There's the grassroots initiatives, which are popping up everywhere. And it's so inspiring because they are not getting help from any funding, from government, from media. They're just, people want to do something better. And it's particularly around local food. There's also local finance, local energy building, community initiatives that start building a meaningful economy. And they include a type of UBI in that, for instance, in some of these local food initiatives, people who can afford it will pay more so that people who can't afford the local, fresh, organic food pay less. And again, because they're able to do that at the community level, they're very motivated. And there's a lot of transparency and accountability that it works really well. And in the same way, in crises now, people who can afford it, supporting funds to support other groups of people who can't afford it. Now, so these small initiatives are extremely inspiring. But there's the other level of the rethinking. And so the degrowth movement has grown a lot. And in the same way, you've got something called the commons movement. There's a new economy initiatives under other labels. I don't know if you've heard of Kate Raworth and the donut economy, but in so many different ways, clearly people are realizing that we need to make fundamental changes to the economy. From my point of view, there are not enough that look at it at a global level. And so in the anti-globalization movement, from my point of view, too many of my colleagues were not aware of the systemic benefit of the opposite system of how do we rebuild local economies? How do we really respect cultural and biological diversity? What does that look like in practical terms? It means more localized development. And that also answers the need for community. It answers the need for people to connect it to life, because the other path has shoved us away from feeling connected to others and connected to nature, into the city, isolated from one another. And what we also need to recognize is that there is a movement of people who went to the city, who tasted the emptiness of it, and who are coming back, particularly after COVID. But even before COVID, we were talking about these trends as ancient futures trends, micro trends that showed that there's an innate hunger for real lived experiences with nature, with the animals, with the plants, and with community, and intergenerational community, old and young. And as I say, also all these differences, racial differences, gender differences, the lived experience of diversity. And so once you start seeing it through these lenses, there's a great deal to feel a faith in human nature, in the human wisdom that's embodied, that is taking us in the right direction, despite huge pressures in the opposite direction. It's not enough. We need to build on it with a framework. But yeah, go ahead.
I'm really happy to react to this, because actually it's my pleasure to announce that tomorrow we are in this hall going to have a big round table discussion with actually 5 expert women and 1 young man who are, among other principles, introducing the degrowth movement, because especially the young man from Czech Republic, he's one of the big promoters of the degrowth movement, and also like he's involved in pedagogical principles of critical thinking. And also we are going to have a mayor, a lady who is a mayor of a small town, and also a co-leader of Green Party, and she is actually in favor of Kate Raworth donut economy. So this is also going to be discussed, and then we are going to link it all to the human rights in the broad meaning and the deep meaning, and there are going to be like 3 ladies from abroad who are also in favor of UBI principles, but also linking it to development of the human creativity and art, which is also about like freedom of science, serving to the human nature and not being mastering it towards the technologies serving the money. And so every one of you is cordially invited to come. It's starting at 4 o'clock. And before that, from 1 p.m., we are also streaming a live speech made by Gabriela Cabaña, who is actually Chilean economical anthropologist, and she's also speaking about like the growth and about how UBI, if it is framed in the right narrative, which is actually the bigger picture, how it really could dismantle these growth principles that are leading us to the wrong direction. So this is like, I guess, like perfect ending. I'm sorry you can't live here in Czech Republic, but
well,
you know, maybe next time. This is just a start, and it would be really